This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. Of the many biblical names that are unusual in our culture, Hezekiah stands high. For some reason, people find it amusing. Occasionally a wag may quote a bogus scripture and attribute it to 1st or 2nd Hezekiah. Despite the tendency to trivialize him, though, Hezekiah was an actual king of Judah, one of the best of them, in fact. But when we go beyond the simple assertion that he is a historical figure, how much do we actually know about him? Can what Scripture says of him be authenticated from other sources? Let's see just what there is of Hezekiah that history can confirm. If we scan a timeline of the history of the Hebrew monarchy, we will find this king rather late in the sequence. After David and Solomon, famous for their rule over the United Kingdom, we will see the twin lines of Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern. About 2 centuries after Solomon, Hezekiah's name appears. When we look at various books or internet sources, we find substantial agreement on this king's position among the kings of Judah. Here's a representative listing, showing that for him, as for many of the kings, he was co-regent with his predecessor and with his successor. So, from about 729 to 716 B.C., he ruled alongside his father, King Ahaz. Then he reigned alone for some 20 years, and for another decade he had his son Manasseh in power with him. Manasseh, by all accounts, was a disaster for the kingdom. But what about Hezekiah? It's easy enough to list him in this way among the kings of Judah. But apart from the Bible account, what historical evidence do we have for him? Before answering that question, we should note what the Bible itself says of him. Some people will be surprised to see how much it does say. There are 3 chapters devoted to him in 2 Kings 18 through 20. 4 chapters of Isaiah from 36 to 39 concern him too, as does 2 Chronicles chapters 29 to 32. Were all these chapters combined, we would almost have enough for a real book of Hezekiah. Then there are other references to him. Proverbs 25:1 notes, "These also are proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied." And besides this, we see mentions of the king in Jeremiah, Hosea, and Micah. All in all, there's perhaps more about Hezekiah than any other king of Israel or Judah in the divided kingdom period. Drawing from these sources, we can arrive at the highlights of the king's career. A sketch of his life might include these major elements. Hezekiah was a reformer, which made him rare among the kings of either Israel or Judah. Seeing how the temple service had not only been neglected, but that all manner of trash had accumulated in the sacred building, he ordered a thoroughgoing purification of the structure. It took the Levites 16 days to accomplish that, and only then could he preside over a restoration of the sacrifices, to the accompaniment of the temple singers, as in the grand old days of King David. Although the kingdom of Judah had not been as steeped in idolatry as had Israel, still the worship of false gods was found in many parts of the countryside. Hezekiah instituted a clean-up here as well, destroying the shrines on the high places of the countryside, and forbidding the idolatrous practices that had become so common there. Even the worship of the true God needed reformation, and Hezekiah decreed that only at the temple could worship and sacrifice to Yahweh be done. As a third part of his reformation for the kingdom, he reinstituted the Passover celebration. He even sent messengers north into the remnants of the destroyed kingdom of Israel, and from there, too, men came to Jerusalem to share in the Passover. Scripture says of that celebration, "So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem." 2 Chronicles 30:26. Among all the kings of either Israel or Judah, few displayed the zeal for God that Hezekiah did. We read of him, "He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses." 2 Kings 18:5 and 6. His faithfulness to God, however, would soon be tested. Sargon II died in 705 B.C., and Hezekiah saw an opportunity to regain some degree of independence from Assyria's oppressive rule. He refused further payment of tribute to them. Assyria's new king, Sennacherib, soon mounted an invasion of Judah in retaliation. He reduced town after town to rubble, and soon was at the very gates of Jerusalem, threatening to destroy Hezekiah's last stronghold. According to the Bible, then it was that the king turned to rely on his God for deliverance. The Assyrians delivered a proclamation demanding surrender, sneering at the idea that God would protect the Jews. The gods of other peoples whom Sennacherib had conquered had been powerless to protect them, and Hezekiah's God would be able to do nothing either. We are told that Hezekiah took the letter into the temple and laid it before the Lord, and his prayer for help was heard in a dramatic way. And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. 2 Kings 19:35 and 36. Then came another test of Hezekiah's faith, because he fell gravely ill. The prophet Isaiah told him, "Get your affairs in order. You're going to die." But the king prayed to God, asking for mercy in view of his faithful service. The Lord replied that he would extend Hezekiah's life by 15 years. Scarcely able to believe this promise, the king asked for confirmation. And Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I shall go up to the house of the Lord on the 3rd day?" And Isaiah the prophet called to the Lord, and he brought the shadow back 10 steps, by which it had gone down on the steps of Ahaz. 2 Kings 20:8 and 11. The shadow of the sun moving backward. Here was a dramatic miracle to climax God's care for this king of Judah. That's the sketch of Hezekiah's life as we find it in Scripture. Can we find evidence from archaeology or secular history to confirm any of this? As for Hezekiah's reforms, we would hardly expect to find anything. The reforms were internal matters of little interest to other nations, and they would leave few physical traces for archaeology to find. And yet there is something. In the excavation of Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem, archaeologists found this six-chamber city gate. There were benches there for the city fathers to hold court, as the Bible describes. And behind one of these chambers was a smaller one, a shrine containing 2 four-horned altars. Excavators believe the shrine belongs to the time of Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, who practiced and encouraged idol worship. These altars have had their horns intentionally cut off to make them useless for idolatry, and the archaeologists found as well that a stone toilet had been installed in the shrine, unmistakably intended to desecrate the pagan shrine. This is what Jehu did to a pagan shrine, as 2 Kings 10:27 says, making it a latrine to this day. So, here is evidence of Hezekiah's reforms, his attempt to undo what his godless predecessor had been practicing. This evidence was found, incidentally, just in 2016. And then there is the Assyrian saga. A sensible king would not rebel against a foreign oppressor without preparing for an attack. And Hezekiah gave attention to his defenses and his water supply. Scripture says he extended the wall of Jerusalem. He set to work resolutely and built up all the wall that was broken down, and raised towers upon it, and outside it he built another wall. 2 Chronicles 32:5. He also had his engineers rework the city's water supply. This same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon, and directed them down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his works. 2 Chronicles 32:30. We find evidence of both of these defensive projects. A 70-yard stretch of the wall, some 10 feet in height, was found by Naaman Avigad in the 1970s. On the tourist maps, it is called the Broad Wall. As for the water supply, Jerusalem's chief source was the Gihon Spring, just outside the eastern wall. Hezekiah's engineers covered the spring, denying it to an invading army, and rerouted the stream under the city of David and into what came to be called the Pool of Siloam. That tunnel, seen occasionally since the 1600s, was explored by Charles Warren in 1865. He soon concluded that it must be the tunnel mentioned in Scripture. This was confirmed by an inscription found on the wall of the tunnel in 1884 that records details of the construction project. The inscription, now in a museum in Istanbul, says that 2 teams of miners worked from opposite ends and met in the center. Scholars still marvel at this. The tunnel is 533 meters long, almost 6 football fields, with a drop of only 1 foot, and it snakes around, as you can see from this cutaway drawing. Some experts believe the diggers were directed by vibrations from above as guides hammered on the earth. In any event, it is a remarkable achievement, and to this day, tourists can walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. As they do, they can stop and read. You are standing at the place where the Shiloh inscription, written approximately 2,700 years ago during the reign of King Hezekiah, was discovered. So much for Hezekiah's preparations. Then Sennacherib invaded. And here the Assyrian records tell us what happened. As for Hezekiah the Judean, who had not submitted to my yoke, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities and surrounding small towns, which were without number. using pack-down ramps and by applying battering rams, infantry attacks by mines, breaches, and siege machines, I conquered them. The so-called Taylor Prism, which was found in the ruins of Nineveh by Colonel Robert Taylor in 1830, records these events. The Assyrian records tell in detail about the siege of the Judean city of Lachish. It was apparently the last major city before Jerusalem, and very difficult to capture. The Assyrians were especially proud of this victory, and recorded it on a huge relief sculpture in their palace. Austin Henry Layard found the palace and reliefs in 1845 through 47. They are now in the British Museum, which has dedicated an entire room to it. It's almost 8 feet high and 80 feet long. On it we can see archers like these attacking Lachish. Text on the relief includes this statement: Sennacherib, the mighty king, king of the country of Assyria, sitting on the throne of judgment, before, or at the entrance of, the city of Lachish, Lachish, I give permission for its slaughter. That left Jerusalem, and we have records there too. Himself, Hezekiah, I locked him up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthworks, and made it unthinkable for him to exit by the city gate. And while the Bible tells of a disaster striking the army, Sennacherib's inscriptions make no mention of it. But neither do they claim that he took the city of Jerusalem. We might wonder why. Oh, yes, there's another piece of secular history on this subject. Herodotus, the Greek historian who is often called the father of history, records Sennacherib's campaign down through Judea and into Egypt, and tells of a terrible setback that crippled the king's army. It's a vague and puzzling story that some believe is a garbled account of what the Bible tells us. Quote, Then after they came, there swarmed by night upon their enemies mice of the fields, and ate up their quivers and their bows, and moreover the handles of their shields, so that on the next day they fled, and being without defense of arms, great numbers fell. End quote. Herodotus, Book 2, 141. Mice and rats were regularly associated with plague and death in antiquity. Perhaps the tale that Herodotus heard about this expedition was a distorted version of what Scripture tells us, that the angel of the Lord destroyed 185,000 of Sennacherib's men outside the walls of Jerusalem. In any event, we know that Jerusalem was not captured, and the Assyrians went home in frustration. God had said that he would fight for the city. Had he not? And as we look to archaeology to tell us about Hezekiah, there is one more thing. It is a tiny token that was discovered in Eilat Mazar's excavation of the Ophel, the area immediately south of Jerusalem's temple area, in 2015. Mazar was using a new technique called wet sifting of the debris from the site. For years it had been standard procedure to run the excavated material through a screen to locate small items that might be missed. But recently they have found that soaking the dirt and debris first makes the process much more effective. One of the volunteers spotted a tiny object, less than half an inch in diameter. It was a bulla. Now, a bulla is a seal impression. An official document on papyrus would be rolled up and tied with twine, with a lump of clay pressed over the knot, and then the sender's signet would be pressed into the wet clay. The resulting impression would verify the identity of the sender. Here are the words from this bulla: belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Without doubt, a seal impression of our king. Now, lots of bullas have been found by archaeologists over the years, and even a few from King Hezekiah are known. But this one was different. For one thing, it has an image of the sun in the center, winged. Earlier seals of Hezekiah had a winged scarab in this position, and then later, perhaps to avoid the representation of a living creature, which the law of Moses forbids, he changed this to a disk of the sun. But this bulla introduces a further change. The wings of the sun slant downward in a protective manner, and to the left and right of them we see an ankh, the symbol of life. Here is how the finders interpreted this change in the symbol. Hezekiah's personal changed symbol had a sun with sheltering wings turned down, and a life symbol at the end of each wing. This special addition of the symbol of life may support the assumption that the change on the king's personal seal was made after Hezekiah had recovered from the life-threatening illness of Shehin, 2 Kings 20, 1-8, when the life symbol became especially significant for him, around 704 BCE. From the Hebrew University of Jerusalem press release, February 12, 2015. The Bible had told us that Hezekiah had a fatal illness, and then God chose to heal him and grant him 15 more years of life. He even did a miracle involving the sun's shadow to confirm that promise of healing. We would hardly expect archaeology to tell us anything useful about that story, would we? But now, in 2015, a student wet-sifting debris from the palace area of ancient Jerusalem spots a tiny bit of clay, and we have, preserved in that clay, visual evidence of Hezekiah's gratitude to God for healing. What a stunning piece of evidence! Hezekiah, a king of Judah, trying to obey God and lead his people amid the swirling currents of war and idolatry in the 8th century BC. Of all that the Bible writers claim for him, how much can archaeology confirm? Quite a lot, as it happens. There's the destroyed pagan shrine at Lachish. There's the death of Sargon II and Hezekiah's rebellion. The so-called Broad Wall and Hezekiah's tunnel show us the preparations the king made to defend his city. Sennacherib's invasion is documented by the Assyrian records themselves, the Taylor Prism, and the huge relief sculpture that is now in the British Museum. The failed siege of Jerusalem is also seen in how the Taylor Prism makes no mention of capturing the city, but just claims to have shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. And Herodotus' garbled story of a crippling blow to the Assyrian army suggests that the Bible's account of God's act to defend Jerusalem is factual after all. And then, contrary to all expectation, a tiny seal impression tells us of Hezekiah's gratitude to God for a miraculous healing. Nowadays, we hear all too often that the Bible cannot be treated as a book of history. It may be a source of inspiring moral tales, but it is chiefly legend, myth, and outright fiction. When we hear such claims, though, we would do well to remember what we've seen about King Hezekiah. The evidence about that king reassures us that when the Bible does history, the Bible does history. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the other lectures in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.